Welcome everyone to the Mid-Career Mentoring Program and to today's topic, writer to editor. My name is Bethany Brookshire. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a freelance science journalist. I will be moderating today's last Q&A of the first inaugural Mid-Career Mentoring Program. But first we'll do some other introductions, and I'd like to start with my colleague, Rodrigo, if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rodrigo Perez Ortega. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a staff writer at Science Magazine. And this has been a wonderful mid-career mentoring program with Bethany. Thank you so much for it, and all the rest of the speakers. I'm just so happy to be here today for this last session. Thank you.
And now we're going to have our mentors today introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how they what was their editing journey. Could we start with Siri, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Siri Carpenter. My pronouns are she, her. And my background is I am a longtime science journalist and editor, more recently an editor. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm a former member of the NASW board. The way that I got into editing was that I was a freelance writer for many years, and then Discover magazine moved from New York to Milwaukee, and I live in Madison, which is about an hour and a half from Milwaukee. And Discover was not, their New York editorial staff were not moving to Milwaukee, surprise, surprise. And so they were hiring a bunch of editors. And a lot of my friends said, you should apply for that job. And I was like, I am a freelancer. I'm not an editor. That's crazy. I don't want to wear shoes. And, but I did eventually decide to apply for that job, and I got that job, and I became an editor at Discover, and I worked there for a couple of years. And then when I left, I started doing freelance editing alongside running the Open Notebook. And nowadays, running the Open Notebook is my full-time editing gig.
And Rachel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Zamzo. My pronouns are also she, her, and I'm sort of on the other end of the spectrum from Siri. I've been a freelance reporter and writer since about 2014, but my editing career is only about 3 years young. So thanks to Siri at the Open Notebook, I've been there starting out initially and then in an official capacity for a couple of years as a senior editor there, editing features and other types of stories for the Open Notebook. So that's my story.
So reminder to everyone, please toss questions into the chat with question in front of it. Rodrigo has to be in and out today, so I'm going to be trying to keep an eye on the chat myself, which is basically going to be a huge challenge even to my intensely hyperactive soul. So if I miss something, I am sorry. Please do not hesitate to post it again or ping me. It's not because I hate you. I don't hate you. I've also dropped a new Open Notebook link into the chat. It's actually to their whole list of topics on editing, because Open Notebook, as you might imagine, has done a great deal on this. Now, first, I wanted to ask both of you a question that actually came in from Slack. Are we all going to eventually be editors? Is this the only natural progression for writers? There, but for the sake of God, go us all. Is this what we're doomed to?
Go ahead, Rachel.
I think this is not the ultimate destination of any writer. I think that for me, certainly it was something I always would have loved to ended up doing, but I do still have my feet in both worlds, and I'd love to keep it that way for as long as possible. And I think for many reporters and writers just don't want to give up that on the ground feeling, having the control over the reporting and the writing. And I think it does take a certain personality to be willing to give up some of that, some of the control, and be willing to take yourself more behind the scenes, to give up the byline is a very practical thing to consider, and to be okay with shepherding a story that you didn't necessarily do the on the ground work on. So I definitely don't think it's something that every writer is going to end up doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, there are some people who know pretty early on in their careers that they want to edit. Either they want that to be their main thing or they want to do some editing. Other people who might go in that direction over time. And there are plenty of people who just only want to be writers, and that's totally great too. And thank God that there are so many brilliant writers who want to devote all of their time to doing that. I kind of thought that that was me until this opportunity to become an editor kind of fell on my lap. And it turned out that I really, really liked being an editor and felt like that was actually a really great fit for me. It wasn't obvious to me beforehand that that would be the case. But I think there's just tons of people who, really love reporting and love writing and, or at least love having written, and who that's just not part of their ambition. So no, I don't think it's anything that is like, if you're not an editor by X stage in your career, you're somehow failing or whatever. It's not like that's the only way to progress and deepen in your career.
I actually recently wrote a guest post for Last Word on Nothing about how writing can be compared to the Bristol stool scale, which is partially due to the effort it takes to write, but also because you always feel better after you've done it. Anyway, I wanted to ask Siri, is there a threshold kind of for switching from writer to editor? Is there kind of a point at which a writer is good enough to be an editor? Or is it a completely different skill set?
I don't think that there's a threshold. No, I think that it's there are many similarities and many shared skills. Obviously, if you're a good writer, that's going to help you in your editing. But there are also a lot of really different skills involved, and I really see them as you could be a mid-career writer and an early career editor, or vice versa. And I think that there's a lot to learn about editing when you become an editor. There aren't a lot of opportunities to learn it in terms of like courses or whatnot. And so it tends to be a real learn on the job type of thing. And, I think there's no moment where you should feel like I can't become an editor until I have achieved X as a writer, until I've been published in the New Yorker or something. It's just not like that. It's a skill, it's a set of skills that you develop over time while you're doing it.
And I also wanted to ask kind of, what are the pros and cons of switching to an editing role versus the pros and cons of remaining a writer? Many of us who are writers, it's very easy to kind of have a grass is greener mentality, right? When you're in the depths of a feature that makes you hate everything about the world. Not that I'm there right now. I would never say that I'm there right now. Anyway.
Familiar. Well, I think it's probably different for everyone. For me, some of the pros of being an editor are I almost never have to look at a blank page. And honestly, I love that. When I was writing, I would do anything to trick my brain into feeling like I was editing and not writing, that I was at an editing stage of my own stories. I would draft stories in a fake email to my editors using like the most relaxed, casual prose possible, just to feel like I wasn't actually writing the story, and then copy and paste that into a Word document and then start editing it from there. Or I would make like elaborate bullet, I'd start with an outline and then just keep elaborating on this outline in bullet form until I had basically written the entire story in bullet points, and then remove the bullet points and start editing it. And I just had this kind of terror of the blank page. And so one thing that I really love about editing is that I'm never dealing with that. I always have something that I am responding to. And it doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily a lot of work to do or that there isn't a creative element to it, but that piece of it has been a real pro for me. Just psychologically, I feel a lot less anxious than I did when I was writing. A con is that you don't get to do the reporting, and the reporting is so fun. And, that's what I miss about being a reporter and the writer is doing the reporting, getting to have those totally nerdy conversations that go on for way too long with scientists, or getting to, just have these moments of discovery and really dive in super, super deep and, go down ridiculous rabbit holes that are a total, feel like they might be a total waste of your time, but they're also just delightful. So you don't get to do that when you're writing. And for that reason, a lot of people like to have a mix of like Rachel, like to have a mix of reporting and editing in their lives. To me, the pros of being an editor have outweighed the cons enough that, and just kind of the way that circumstances have arisen have meant that I have ended up pretty much dropping reporting. Who knows, maybe tomorrow something will come along that I feel like I have to actually write, but I think everybody finds that different mix.
So that actually brings me well into this, because Rachel, you're actually doing a mix right now. And I was wondering if, since you're the one who kind of transitioned into editing most recently, how does one get into editing, especially as a freelancer? I could see it, at a staff publication, they need somebody to like do a copy editors, and I don't know. But like, how does one break in as a freelancer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So from my personal experience, my true answer is just befriend Siri Carpenter and work for her, because she throws the opportunities at your way. So that's really how I got into editing in the real sense. But I think that the trick is to just make yourself available and make sure people know that you're available, especially if you're a freelance reporter and writer. If you're working with a publication or editors for a while, but you want to do editing and they don't know that, then you're not going to, be able to get your foot in that door. So I feel like just being obnoxiously obvious about your interest in editing. I feel like any new editors that I meet now, since I feel like I have a little bit of experience to rest on editing wise, I'm throwing out there constantly. And if you're looking for editing work, I'm now available for that as well. Just kind of being a little bit, sell yourself a little bit. And also think about casting a pretty wide net. I think Siri's mentioned this before, but the idea of taking on editing gigs that aren't necessarily traditional journalism. So academic editing, if you have an advanced degree or experience doing academic writing, doing that type of editing is in high demand, and you can at least throw that to a potential journalistic editor who may want to see some of your editing work.
That's a really good point. And I was actually wondering, how do you go about kind of making that happen? Like, how do you go to an academic editor and say like, hi, I'm a journalist and I quit science and I would like editing work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't done any postgraduate school academic editing myself, but I feel like if anyone on here has been to graduate school, I feel like if people identify you as a writer, someone who likes to write, then people will throw manuscripts at you. Please look at this. So I feel like if you have connections from grad school or know academics who might want to connect you with people that are writing manuscripts, especially if there's someone who is trying to write for an English journal and English isn't their first language, they might want just a read for an edit for readability, and that's something you could help people with.
Though I will say, a lot of times, if you know people in the academic world, as someone who came from there, they do not want to pay you for that.
Yes, that's a very good point as well.
So I did want to ask, I mean, I recognize that, the key to life as a science journalist is in fact knowing Siri Carpenter, but I was wondering, how do you go about getting and cultivating an editing mentor to kind of help you get started?
Yeah, I think that, so Siri's obviously mine, but I think that would have been the first recommendation I would have for anybody, is just think about the editors that you know and trust, ones that you're already working with as a reporter, the ones that are good editors that make you feel good about yourself as you're looking through their edits, and just ask them for advice about the way that they do what they do, and also just look at their copy, look at the edits they give you, or if you can get your hands on the copy for other writers that they've edited, and try to reverse engineer it like we all do as science journalists. Look at really great stories and see how they got to that point. But if you can get your hands on edited copy and see the comments and see the changes, it's really game changing as far as developing confidence as an editor, and that person could be a mentor for you as well.
So I actually wanted to ask Siri to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of editing, because, I was a writer on staff, but I will admit that like I wasn't like looking over my editor's shoulders as they did their jobs. So how long should a first edit, for example, take if you're trying to become an editor? You know, writers often charge by the word, but editors charge by the hour, obviously. So how long does that end up taking? And I recognize that's probably pretty variable.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's highly situational depending on the publication, the type of story, the length of the story, who the writer is. You know, some drafts are in a lot rougher shape than others. And I want to pause in saying that to say that's not because some writers are better writers than others. I mean, of course, like everything in life, there are things that there are people who have more skills than others, but we all have stories that trip us up more than others as writers. And so you never know when a draft comes in, you know, whether this is going to be one where the writer got, you know, they went so deep down that rabbit hole and they got really tangled up in all of the details, and they really, that story needs a lot of help to kind of to pull everything together and synthesize things, or whether it's going to be something that requires a lighter edit. So I don't think that there's any easy answer to that question, how long should it take? If you're a freelance editor and you're trying to decide, like, is this a good deal that I'm being offered for editing this story? Let's say we have a 2,000 word story for you, and you know, we're going to offer you $200 to edit it. That's unlikely to be a good deal unless it's, you know, turns out to be a story that's in really, really great shape, but you never know. When I started doing freelance editing and I had to figure out the answer to that question, how much, you know, how much should I want to be paid for stories, if I'm being paid by the story and not by the hour. I asked around a bunch of other features editors what they thought was the kind of the average amount of time that they would spend on feature. I think that I used 3,000 words as sort of the benchmark, so you can kind of scale up and down from there. And the answer that I got, and this kind of bore out in my own experience afterwards, was that it typically, people planned on it taking anywhere from 15 to 35 hours for the full course of editing a feature story of that length. 15 to 35 is a really broad range. And you know, a big chunk of that is that first pass, but a significant chunk of it might be a second edit or a third edit. And that's assuming that you're not deeply involved in like art meetings and stuff, but you're just talking about actually editing the story, communicating with the writer over the story. You know, maybe you're going to do 2 or 3 rounds of edits. For a feature around that scale, I think around, you know, 15 to 30 hours or so is pretty typical. It's not unheard of to go a lot longer, and every once in a while there's a miracle situation where it's a lot shorter. So if you're getting paid by the project, you know, it's like a lot of things where some things are going to really turn out to pay you better by the hour than others, and it's difficult to predict. I would say for if you were editing, like, say, 1,000 word piece, you know, 800 to 1,000 words, like a news feature or a long news story or something, you might expect that you're going to spend, if it were me, and maybe I'm slow, but I would expect that maybe I would spend something like 4 to 6 hours on that first pass, unless it's a situation where the writer has been writing for this publication really regularly and I'm editing for it regularly, so everybody's kind of in a groove. But for something that gets into feature territory, I think that's about where it would start on the lower end. What do you think, Rachel? Is that in keeping with what your experience is?
Yeah, I agree. I think that I might be on the slower end too, but I was thinking, right when you were saying that, I was thinking about 4 to 6 hours, so very similar.
And actually, Eva, your question came in at exactly the right time, because I was about to ask about this. One of the things that seems most scary kind of as an editor is you're the person who's making the final call on a piece of text. How do you go about developing confidence? Several people in the Slack have noted they felt imposter syndrome about this. And Siri, you mentioned that one of your first edits was Carl Zimmer.
Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure.
So how do you build confidence in your editing abilities, like your ability to literally mess with somebody else's words?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say that often you may or may not be the person who's literally the last word on that story, but more often than not, there's a team of editors who end up, passing this thing around, and the poor writer has to deal with the points of view of multiple editors. So, often it's not the case that the buck stops with you when you're the primary editor on a story. But whether you are or not, you're right that, having a sense of confidence in doing it is important. I think that there are a few things that can give you that confidence. One of them is just recognizing that there's a reason that you were hired to be the editor for this publication. And that's because you have good story sensibilities. And what you bring as an editor to a story is your own curiosity, your sense of curiosity. So are you bored when you're reading this story? You're probably not going to be the only one who's bored. You have distance from the story that the writer doesn't, because you haven't read the 50 PDFs that the writer had to slog through. You haven't interviewed the 15 people that the writer had to, interview and then distill into 2 quotes from that person. So you have a distance from the story. You have your ear, and I think that's really important. And I remember my editing mentor at Discover was Pam Weintraub. And she told me one time early, in fact, I think it might have been that story of Carl Zimmer's, that first story that I was editing, where I was like, I don't know, this doesn't quite sound right to me, but it's Carl Zimmer, like it must be right. and she said, just use your ear. And I feel like that's really great advice. So you want to have humility as an editor. You don't know everything, and you don't want to go in with guns blazing. And excuse me for saying that. You don't want to go in with this kind of false sense of confidence. But to have humility, but also a sense of like, if I'm confused at this point, probably other people would be too. If I'm bored at this point, probably other people would be too. You might not always know what the answers are, but you probably are right that there's something wrong. And it might be that it's too detailed, or it might be that there aren't enough details. It might be that this thing should just come before this so that this thing makes sense, and there just needs to be a reordering. It might be that there's logic between the points that the writer isn't expressing, because it all makes sense in the writer's head because they read those 50 PDFs. But you coming in fresh with that distance are like, I don't understand how this point really, why is this sentence even after this sentence? But you can recognize that something seems to be missing, and you might not have all the answers. Your job is not to go in and rewrite and fix the story in one fell swoop. Your job is to recognize what might stump readers or bore readers or whatever. So I think the answer to like, how do you get confidence, is to sort of just believe that you deserve to have confidence. And having confidence is not the same as having all the answers.
And I also wanted to kind of follow up on that and ask how you go about kind of giving a good but kind critique. Because, as you mentioned, yeah, we're translating things that are very boring to people into things that are theoretically not boring to people, but sometimes we fail and we are boring. Sometimes we don't make any sense. How do you kind of develop a kind, balanced editorial style?
I mean, I think most people are kind people at heart. And if you are going into your edit with a sense of empathy, both for your reader and for the writer you're working with, and remembering that writer is a person who, assume that they're doing their best, then I think you're going to feel a sense of wanting to deliver your edits in a way that is kind. Doing it in a way that's kind and still firm enough to be effective is a skill. It's one of the skills of editing that you kind of got to learn. Often, if you're reading a story and you're just getting like frustrated by how confused you are, or you're like, why isn't this better? It can really help to just get on the phone or get on a Zoom with the writer and have a conversation about it. First of all, because you can like straighten out a lot of the confusions about the story in that conversation. And second of all, because it just reminds everyone involved that you're just people and that, you know, you want to be kind to each other and that you are in a collaborative situation. So it kind of eases that sense of frustration. And then, you know, and thinking about, you know, thinking about how to deliver your actual edits in a kind way, just remembering that a lot of the things that we write, we don't have tone of voice going for us in writing them. So if you write an edit and you just say, this is confusing, we should cut this, etc. Like there's a time and a place to do that, you know, especially if you really have a longstanding relationship with a writer and you really understand each other well and you know that that person is going to be able to take that, you know, that, you know, you're very secure in your, you know, respect for each other and all of that. But if you think about how is this going to read to someone who is not inside your head, you know, when you were writing it, and just think about, are you framing it in a way that is that's kind and generous and that, you know, assumes that they have the intelligence and skills to be able to address it.
I have one editor who we have a very good relationship, and at one point she actually put in a comment next to a sentence I wrote, why in all caps. And I actually kept it because I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah.
But I could see how other people might not find that.
There's a time and a place for that. I will tell you, one time I had edited a story at Discover, and then Pam Weintraub was top editing it, and she, you know, did not feel that my edits were sufficiently addressing the issues in the story, and she was confused at some point in the story, and she did all her editing in all caps, and there was this comment that said, this is a comment to me that said, at this point my brain is flying off into outer space. I was like, okay, so this isn't clear enough then. Got it. But I was talking with Pam every single day, many times a day, and it struck me as a funny remark. It wouldn't have struck me as a funny remark if it had come from an editor at a publication who I hardly knew. I would have just felt like, oh my God, they hate me. I'm a failure. I'm never going to make it in this business. So, there's a time and a place for that kind of commentary. I'd say sparing.
And so I think many of us feel that, well, I know as a writer, I often feel that the best edits are kind of a gentle nudges, like suggestions. And I like that because then they're basically like, fix it yourself. Here, fix this. Because I feel like I learn more when someone says, this isn't working. Here's how you fix it. Now go fix it. But there are also times when editors will just go in and fix it. Right? Your draft is bleeding because they literally just changed everything. And I was wondering, how do you differentiate between the time to kind of gently guide and the time to just say, change it?
Rachel, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a skill that I am definitely still in the throes of kind of working on. But Siri's taught me a lot in the sense of changing your editing approach to like phases as you're working with the writer. So instead of just going in right away with, deep line edits, taking a step back and looking at the story, seeing structurally what it needs, what holes are there, what voices are missing, and also being very transparent with the writer about what phase you are at. So, just letting you know this first round is going to be, not substantive line edits. It's going to be a structural approach, making sure things are in the right place. And then you can expect line edits later. So they don't think they're not, betrayed later on when you're doing line edits on something they thought was golden. So they kind of know how you're walking them through it, and just being aware of, the way that they're taking all of your edits from you, if that makes sense.
And we have a question that sort of feels kind of like a follow-up for me for that. So Rachel, when you're editing a new writer versus a seasoned writer, does that change your approach? Like, how do you kind of alter your approach when you're dealing with, someone who's been in the business 10 years versus someone who's been in for one?
Yeah, I think it depends on what type of story you get in. So if the seasoned writer's story truly reflects, who you think they are, then I don't think it's going to take the same sort of hand-holding approach that a newer writer might have. But with the new writer, especially, I think I was thinking about this. We were talking about the way you can have a balanced editing approach is to edit the way you would like to be edited as a writer. So Bethany, you mentioned the gentle nudges. Taking taking a look through all of your edits after you've done them before it goes back to the writer and think, am I saying this in the most, polite and way possible? Is this a change that's actually necessary, or is it something I just kind of want it to be different? And then I am notorious, if someone was to see my email to a writer with their first line or round of edits back to them, I just have a wall of text about all of the things that I'm going to tell them about the thing they're about to open, especially if it's a newer writer, especially if it's going to be a heavy lift, just so they feel like I'm not just like, well, good luck with that one, see you next time. It's just a lot of explaining around sort of what I think is going on with the story, so they don't feel like they're just dropped into the deep end.
So what I'm hearing here is a lot of kind of people management, emotional management, emotional padding.
Right.
And I was actually wondering, how do you deal with managing writers and kind of making the transition from being kind of a fellow writer to being a manager of writers? Because of course, once you start editing, you will start editing people even your friends. And I was wondering, how have you made that transition and how do you kind of enforce those boundaries?
Yeah, I think as Siri mentioned before, it comes down to confidence and trusting that you're in the role as an editor that you're in for a reason, that other people have trusted you with that responsibility, and to sort of just set that imposter syndrome aside and work with any writer as you would, whether they're your friend or not. And also just remember that you are there to advocate for the reader, for the audience, and it's not necessarily your job to um, fluff anybody else's confidence, but to really think about what the reader might find boring or difficult to understand. And that can also inform how you write your edits, so you're not necessarily directing at changes at the writer, like, well, you wrote this bad, make it so like, I don't know if the reader is going to quite find this interesting or find it engaging or find it easy to understand. And it also helps in doing that, you reminding the writer that they're also there to serve the reader too. So you're both kind of a team. We want to make this the best thing that it can be for the reader's sake. So it takes a little bit of the pressure off you as well as the writer, if you remember that it's not about you or for you.
So we actually had another question. Yes, so from Carmen, that I think is really good, that you guys have been mentioning, the responsibility here is kind of to the reader, right? And like making the story good and interesting for the reader. And Carmen says, Siri's story about Pan made me think, in theory, editors edit for the reader, but how common is it to fall into the habit of editing for the top editor above you? Related to confidence, but how do you develop the skills to push back or come to consensus with other editors as well as the writer? That's a really super good question.
Yeah, it is a great question. I think in the ideal scenario, you're editing for, if you have that top editor in mind, it's because that top editor is also a stand-in for your readers. And maybe you have previous conversations with them in mind, or previous stories that you've edited with them, but you're all working with the readers in mind ultimately. Do we kind of sometimes fall away from doing that and forget about the reader? I think, we're all human, and sometimes that does happen. I think that I find that there are times when I'm editing and I'm very explicitly thinking about my readers, at the Open Notebook. Like, I think that people will really want more details about how to do this, or like, I envision that people will want to be able to click on a link to pursue this further or whatever. And I'm really thinking about those specific things. Other times I think it's just more implicit, that I've always thought of myself as the audience for the Open Notebook. We started the Open Notebook because we wanted to learn this craft better. And so I felt like any story that answered my questions was answering the questions of my ideal audience. And so I still tend to go into stories, I think, thinking of myself just implicitly as one of those ideal readers. And obviously there are certain types of stories where I'm not, if it's a story that's really for data journalists, I'm not a data journalist. So then I'm, doing more to try to imagine what a data journalist might be wondering, what do they already know? And I'll have to rely more on the writer to understand that and reveal that through their reporting. Or if it's a story for, we had a story, for example, about freelancing on a US visa, student visa. Well, I'm not freelancing on a US student visa. I can't bring my own, history of having questions about that to bear, but this is where, trying to have that sense of empathy. When I talk about empathy, I'm not just talking about like being nice, being sympathetic, but I'm talking about like trying to get inside the head and understand what would people be wondering. I think a lot of that is implicit. And so if you are editing with your top editor in mind, I think by extension you're editing with your readers in mind as well. And and then there are other little things I think where you're just like, oh, I know that I had an editor, the managing editor at Discover. One of her pet peeves was whether you said the past year or the last year. And so we all just learned, like in all of our stories, we are always going to say the past year because this is just her thing and she hates that. And, I don't think our readers really cared about that, but I knew like, if I say the last year, it's just going to get changed to the past year later. So, sort of got trained to do that.
So I kind of wanted to follow up on the idea of maintaining this outside perspective and kind of being this person um, kind of who stands in for the reader. And I'd be interested to hear Rachel's take on this because, of course, many of us are coming from science writing to editing. And some of us actually come with significant scientific training. So we come in with more expertise than the average reader, if not from our scientific training, from the years that we've spent reading and breathing and living science, right? How do you cultivate an outside perspective, even when you actually know the topic going in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that as an editor, I'm not necessarily editing within my expertise. The open notebook is so, meta, but if I was editing in areas where I have expertise and reporting and writing expertise, I think that the thing I would try to remember is, I mean, again, I think it just comes back to the reader, like if we have enough expertise, I think we also have enough expertise to know what we know because of our expertise and to know that what we have is coming from that and what other people don't have, if that makes any sense. So you might be able to identify areas where a reader is not going to understand something simply because you know that you only know that because of all of your background. So just trying to keep that in mind. And again, I mean, it's like the cliche, like, will your grandmother, assuming she doesn't have a PhD, understand this, and things like that. Just keeping, and also if you're editing for a publication that you're very familiar with, which is presumably the case, it's not going to be that often that you're editing for a publication that you're also new to, you have a really good grasp on the types of the voice of those stories and the audience for those stories. So I feel like it may seem hard to do having not done it, but if you're in that situation, I think it actually comes a little bit easier because you already have such a good feel for the publication and its audience.
Yeah, I've kind of found that as I kind of move into mid-career, I feel like it's a sign of mid-career that I can like look at a story and go, oh yeah, that's a Slate story. Oh yeah, that's a Science News story. Oh yeah, that's a SciAm story. And like you don't even know, it doesn't have to say the publication on the top, just like lay one eyeball on it. I could do it within the first two paragraphs. And I think that's, just the more experience you get kind of in the field. So we had a question from the chat. Editing the language and filling holes in a story is one skill, but what about the thought and skill that goes behind what to commission and how to steer a publication's direction?
That's really awesome question. And it is something that I was hoping we would get the chance to talk about today, because I think it's can be underappreciated how much the experience of editing a story is driven by whatever came before that story was assigned. And so when I think about like what sets you up for success when you're editing a story, and sometimes as the editor, you don't have any control over that, especially if you're a freelance editor, you might just get handed a story to edit that has already come in. So you didn't have any role in the process of assigning it. But if you do have any role in the process of assigning a story, I think that there are a number of things that you can do that can kind of increase the chances of success with the story. One is to understand, like, what are the red flags that, what are the things that could become problems in this story? So is it, if you're looking at a pitch, are the ideas underdeveloped for what they should be in a pitch? Of course, they're not going to be fully developed. The story has not been reported and written yet. But if the pitch is kind of thin and the ideas are sort of superficial, then that's a sign that it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't assign the story, but it might mean that you want to do more work with that reporter before deciding to assign that story, have more conversations or ask for a revised pitch or whatever. If the pitch asks a lot of questions but doesn't suggest any answers, I'm just gonna look into this question. It suggests that there may or may not be interesting answers to that question that will make a good story. And if you're like, wow, that is a good question, go off, write 3,000 words on this, and then it turns out that the writer didn't really, either there aren't very interesting answers or that reporter just wasn't really able to access them, then you're going to be really struggling when it comes time to actually edit the story. Another thing is if a pitch, sometimes pitches, there's something that really grabs you. That's like a really colorful idea or a funny thing or something that's really quirky or weird. And it's easy, I think. I'd be interested to hear what other editors here think, but I think one of the sort of rookie mistakes that I've made was to be pulled in by some kind of superficial piece of color in a pitch that the pitch itself wasn't really solid. It didn't have that like core to it that it needed to have. So I think a really key editing skill is when you're evaluating ideas, whether it's that you're looking at freelance pitches or you're on staff somewhere and people are talking about story ideas, is to really interrogate not interrogate the writer, but interrogate what is the center of this story. What do we really understand? Is there evidence to back up the angle that the person is proposing? Is this an original idea? Is the core idea truly intriguing, or is it just that there's some kind of intriguing, sparkly thing that is actually tangential or superficial? So having all of those kinds of conversations early on is super important in that planning stage before you're assigning or while you're assigning a story. And then thinking about, like, I learned this idea from Apurva Mandavili one time, of thinking about a story in terms of maximum and minimum. So in the ideal case where everything works out perfectly and we have unlimited time and resources and skills to pursue this story, what would this story look like in that really, ideal or maximum type of situation, like the dream story? And then what is the minimum? So what would this story need to have in order for us to not kill it? Right. And to understand what that maximum and minimum are. And, in most cases, you're going to end up somewhere between the two. You're rarely going to have the maximum. You're rarely going to have the minimum. But having kind of set those out in your mind a bit and talked about it with the writer is, I think, a really helpful exercise, because it could be that the writer doesn't realize, like, at a minimum, we need to have this, or just hasn't thought that through, or hasn't thought like, wow, in the ideal situation, we would have this. And, maybe that's something, some aspects of that maximum are something that the reporter can actually aspire to, but might not have thought about. So just, really putting the work into the planning process, rather than just crossing your fingers and hoping for a good result, by quickly assigning a story and getting it off your desk for the next week or 6 weeks or whatever it is.
So I did actually want to ask Rachel. I know you're still both editing and writing and reporting, and I was wondering, how has editing changed your reporting skills and your writing skills? What have you kind of taken from your editing back to your writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I feel like I've developed sort of my own editor's voice that is now in my head, in addition to the editor's voice that's also in my head, the person that I'm working for as a reporter. So I can kind of, I feel like I can catch structural problems or, you know, things that my editor's already going to point out before I file that first draft. And so I feel like perhaps my stories have this maybe extra bit of polish. That sounds like I'm really thinking I'm great here. But and on the flip side of that though, it's also allowed me to trust the editing process more, being having been on the inside of it. So I'm definitely a recovering perfectionist. I still do, but I'm trying to be less obsessed with filing just like the perfect story. And I know it's going to, you know, get in most cases ripped to shreds in a good way and come out far better on the other end. And so now I feel like I have a little bit more confidence in how it's going to, the story's going to be in good hands with an editor. And I don't obsess about every tiny little detail before I file that initial draft. I think I also have a sense of where the holes are in a story more than I did before. You know, whose voice is missing, especially sourcing. I feel like as an editor, you're constantly asking the question of, you know, who's not included, whose voice do we need to be hearing from in the story that we don't have. And I feel like that changes not even just my writing but my reporting from the get-go now as I'm working on a story that I'm doing myself, is making sure I'm covering all my bases, because I can hear an editor being like, but did you talk to this person? So I kind of go ahead and try to hit that beforehand.
This actually leads into a question that we had come up earlier in the chat. Are there any hidden conflict of interest situations you should keep an eye out for when you become an editor, especially if you are doing both writing and editing projects at the same time?
I have not really come now, all of my editing and writing has been all within the journalistic sphere, so I haven't really run into a conflict of interest situation in the, you know, financial sense of like I'm working for, you know, writing for this institution but then editing a similar subject. So I don't know, maybe Siri can jump in, or if other people have experience with that, but I'm not sure.
I don't know if I've run into anything myself. I can imagine a type of scenario. I guess I can imagine a couple types of scenarios, or ones that I have heard of other people encountering. Um, One is if you're a freelancer and you're reporting and editing, I suppose you could end up in a situation where you're editing a story on a topic for one publication, and you are working on something that is somehow related to that story for a different publication. And in that case, I think you would need to be really careful and thoughtful about how you're approaching that, and basically making sure that you are not poaching a writer's ideas and using them for yourself as you're writing for some other publication. Um, so that's one type of thing, I think. There's also the classic type of conflict that you can have, like I just saw Jill Sakai's name pop up in the chat. She does freelance editing and she does institutional writing, and I know she's always, and maybe she can speak up more about this, but had to be careful about making sure that when she's editing, she is not editing stories that relate to the institution that she writes for in a way that would be inappropriate. I do think that there is more, generally more leeway about institutional relationships or historical institutional relationships for editors than there is for writers, just because you do have that layer of remove as the editor that you don't have as a writer. But I think it still is something to be careful of. But yeah, I can't think of a situation that I personally have run into where it's felt like there's a conflict of interest per se.
We also have a follow-up from the chat asking, following up from what Siri's been talking about story assignments. How do you manage the balance between the need for more reporting before you can effectively evaluate a story idea and the economic reality that a writer can't necessarily put time into the story without a promise of paying rent?
Yeah, it's really tough because you can't assign a story on a total guess about whether it's going to work out or not. And sometimes you get pitches that are just really well fleshed out and it's easy. I just assigned a story yesterday where I was like, that sounds great, let's do it. And I didn't have any follow-up. But it's often the case that I'm like, not quite this angle for us, but if there were an angle that were a little more like this, or could you say a little more about the types of questions that you would want to dig into, or the types of people you'd want to talk to? I don't need an exact source list, but a kind of a sense of the types of people and what their expertise or experiences are that you would be including. I feel like it's appropriate to ask for that level of detail, but it's not appropriate to ask people to go on a fishing expedition. I mean, if people want to go on a fishing expedition in order to initially pitch a story, that's their prerogative. Sometimes people just get really curious and they start digging around and do a lot of it before they pitch a story. It's always up to a writer. If I ask, for a revised pitch, I understand that the writer may or may not feel like it is in their financial interest to do so, or it might be that I'm suggesting an angle that they're like, that angle actually just isn't that interesting to me. So, they don't have to. So I guess I kind of approach it from the perspective of it's a free world. And until I've commissioned a story, the writer is free to pull out. And I do try not to ask for an absurd amount of stuff, but part of pitching is you have to make the case for your story. So the alternative would be to take a pitch that's really doesn't do that and just say, no thanks, this pitch wasn't good enough, and not invite them to come back to you with a more detailed pitch. And there's times where the story is like so off base for you that you just know it's not going to work out, but or you just know like your slate is full and you're not going to be able to assign it or whatever. But it is a tricky balance. I feel like I'm kind of skirting that question because I don't know that there's a right answer, but I think it's ultimately the control has to remain with the writer, whether they decide how much time they decide to invest in their pitches. And it can, sometimes it can be a lot.
So we have time for one more question in the recorded portion. And I wanted to toss this one to Rachel. We often think of editing as kind of just reactive, right? You edit what comes to you, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I know you've been working on kind of developing an editing strategy. And I was wondering if you could talk about how that works. What does that look like?
Yeah, I've kind of alluded to it already, and this is really borrowing from working with Siri. And then a while back in some situation, I can't even remember, I heard Roxanne Comsey mention sort of a 3-tiered approach, where the first round, and again, you're communicating with the writer that this is your approach to, have transparency throughout the whole time, but to really do a full read through, just like Siri, I'm working on doing that more and more. Without editing at all. And then after you've read through the story in full, then look at the big picture structural issues. So, and again, you'll be familiar with the publication that you're editing for. So you should have an idea of the quote unquote formula that publication typically follows. And you can kind of see where a story that's come in that just doesn't quite flow in the right way. And so thinking about where things need to move to make that flow better, and then handing it back to the writer, getting it back, and then sort of assessing what they've done and starting to work towards line edits. And I feel like there, especially working with newer writers, to allow for this to be a sort of a growth opportunity for them, giving them suggestions for, this perhaps needs to be rephrased for this reason, not just this isn't good, make it better. But I really, and still as a newer editor, I have to sit on my hands because I love writing. It's why I still do, that other half of my work. It would be so much easier just to get in there and make it the way you want it to sound. But that's not going to do the writer any good. And so I literally sometimes sit on my hands and, ask them to rephrase in a certain way, give them at least 1 or 2 chances to do that over the course of the editing rounds, assuming you have enough time to do that many rounds. And only after, 2 or 3 chances that you've given them to make the phrasing better for the flow or for the clarity or the conciseness, then do I go in and actually do a little bit of rewriting. But I feel like this is again following Siri's example, either in a comment or in parentheses after that, put in or something like this in the voice that you have as a writer, because I would never want a writer to come back and be like, they just made that their own and not mine. So it's that delicate balance of making it better when it needs to be made better, but not stealing all of the writer's sort of sense of self as the writer of that story.
So first, thank you. We're going to switch over to the non-recorded portion. So I'm just going to stop the recording here.